How can knowing chess studies help you save a lost position in a real game? Let's take a look at the following example. White has only one pawn left against 3 black pawns. The black king can easily stop it, and at first glance, it seems that the position cannot be saved. However, let's recall the famous ready endgame study. It's a position where the white king is very far away from the opponent's passed pawn. In that classic study, the black pawn is running toward the square h1, and we can see that to stop it, the white king needs to enter the square of the pawn, but he's clearly far outside of it. Meanwhile, the black king is already inside the square of white's pawn on c6 and can easily stop it. Once again, it looks hopeless, but white saves the game by using a brilliant trick. The white king starts moving toward the opponent's pawn, while at the same time heading toward his own pawn. For example, if black pushes their pawn forward, then white plays king to e7, and they manage to promote their pawn with check, leading to a drawn queen endgame. And if the black king tries to stop the pawn instead, white supports it. And once again, we get pawn to h1 equals queen, pawn to c8 equals queen, and the result is a drawn queen endgame. Now, if the black king tries to stop the c6 pawn instead of pushing pawn to h3, then the white king goes not to e7, but to e5. By combining movement toward his own pawn with the idea of approaching the enemy pawn, white manages to save the game. If black captures the pawn, then comes king to f4, and now the white king is inside the pawn square. After pawn to h3, the white king continues king to d6, then king to c7, and once again the position is a draw. By the way, there's an important detail: if the white king had been on e6, then after queen to h3, white would have lost their queen. Now let's return to our actual game. The ideas are exactly the same. The first move is king to g6. Now let's see how black can respond. If they move their king to b6 to capture the pawn, then white plays king to g7. If black captures the pawn on c6, it leads to a draw after king to f6. However, capturing the pawn on h6 is a mistake, because in that case, black manages to take control of the key squares around the pawn on f6, and wins the game. If black pushes their pawn forward with pawn to f5, then the white king begins the chase and goes to king to f6. Let's look further. After pawn to f4, white continues with king to e5, and we see the same idea at work. If black captures on c6, then they lose the pawn on f4, and that position is completely drawn. If instead black advances their pawn, then white plays king to d6. Here we get a pawn race, which again leads to a drawn queen endgame. The key point is that black cannot force white to exchange queens. White only needs to play carefully. For example, when facing checks, the white king must retreat but never to e6, because after queen to h3, black gives a cross-check, and white loses their queen. It's also important not to move the king to d7 after certain checks, because then follows another check, and although white doesn't lose the queen immediately, after queen exchanges, we'd reach a winning pawn endgame for black. The problem for black is that if white avoids such mistakes, they can never win. Now, what happens if black decides to push the h-pawn forward instead? The same idea applies. White captures the pawn on f6, just like in the ready study, and tries to reach their own pawn on c6. After king to c6, white replies with king to g5, stopping the pawn and saving the game. Then after pawn to h4, comes king to e5. And once again, white combines two ideas, approaching their own passed pawn while also blocking the opponent's. But what if black tries to push another pawn, for example pawn to f5? In this case, white cannot take the pawn on f5, because then the black king would reach the pawn on c6, and the connected black pawns would win. As soon as the king captures the pawn on g7, the second pawn promotes. So, the same principle applies. White should capture the pawn on g7. Now, after pawn to f4, white plays king to f6, aiming to reach their own pawn on c6 in time. If black pushes pawn to f3, white continues with king to e7, and once again, they manage to help the pawn on c6 promote to a queen. The result is another drawn queen endgame on the board. The extra pawn doesn't help black, and white can probably capture it easily, giving checks along the way. But after king to b6, the white king once again runs to king to e5, attacking the pawn on f4. What should black do? They must push the pawn forward. But then follows king to d6, and we reach yet another drawn queen ending. After pawn to h5, the same thing happens. The key to saving this position is to capture the pawn on g7. That's the only way white survives. So, after king to b6, white moves their king to the center of the board, king to e5. Then, after king to c6, white replies with king to f4, and the white king is again inside the square of the h-pawn. Finally, after pawn to h3, comes king to d6, and the c-pawn promotes to a queen. This is how knowledge of classical chess ideas can help you save a game. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. See you next time.